afterwards for review and digestion. So again, thanks for joining us. I'm going to kick off with an intro. As I said, these are our panelists today. The topic of discussion really is about what is the biggest challenge that we face as an industry on our projects, and from a technical perspective, implementing BIM across multidisciplinary projects. One of the biggest challenges that we face is managing all the information. So how do we deal with this, constant flow of data and ever-growing information? Widely across our industry, the answer is collaboration, right? Which is a catchphrase. What does it really mean? So how do you all work together? One of the biggest problems is, we try to work together, but if we want to work together, we might end up like this, right? Which is a bunch of different people shouting different things and not understanding each other because they're not speaking the same language. So we need to really all speak the same language, and in a standardized way, ideally, integrate and share information. So we have different parties on projects. We have architects, we have engineers, we have the client, we have contractors and cost consultants. We have all sorts of different players, and they all have their own systems. They all need to be able to share information from those systems into one central area for a project. But it's very difficult to do because the systems don't necessarily speak to each other. So in the UK, which is where Asite has had its genesis and where our company is based, we've done a lot of work in the industry over there to kind of define ways of working together. And there's been efforts by the UK government to define standards. One of the outputs from those efforts has been the definition of something called a common data environment, or CDE. So a common data environment is quite simply a repository, a shared repository for project teams or for clients to hold all the information relevant to a project, which information includes design, it also includes commercial information, cost, schedule, etc. So all of that information needs to be held centrally, and that's called a common data environment. It's a pretty basic idea, but the definition of it and the requirement of it on projects has created a step change. Now, this can be simple, and it can be complicated, right? And so this is a complicated view of lots of different common data environments across different suppliers, different elements of the supply chain all working together. Ultimately, the whole point is trying to get all that information into one central place for the project, for the asset. And in order to do that, the real key is integration. These are some of the things that you need to think about in order to successfully roll out a CDE, right? So it needs to be able to work basically wherever you are. So we're on this webinar today. People are logging in from around the world. Some of you are on computers, some of you are on mobile phones, probably some of you are on iPads, etc. That's the way. That's the reality of the world that we're in today. And your BIMs, your CDEs, need to work the same way. I'm going to pass over now to our first panelist, Paul Beaty-Pownall. Paul, if you want to step on the line. Paul is going to talk about BIM and his experiences implementing it.
Thank you very much, Nathan. So I'm from BPR Architects. We're based in London. I'm sitting in an office here in Putney, West London, taking part in the conversation that's going around the world, and it's an amazing experience. We've been working using BIM principles since about 2012, and it came out of the fact that after the recession, we kind of shrunk a bit, and it was a real opportunity to begin to look ahead whilst we were a small team of architects and use kind of, I must admit, a little bit of spare time to kind of focus on how to structure the business going forward. And it was at the time that the government here in the UK had decided that it wanted to modernise the building industry and align it with a lot of other industries who have become much better at managing their supply chain. But a lot of the discussions that I've been part of are about how much does BIM cost and is it worth it? And we've certainly found it's worth it. I'll start that point. I think it makes our ways of working significantly more efficient within the office. But it's also improving a number of other processes that we go through in the design workflow, particularly in checking documents, not eliminating risk, but certainly reducing risk, being able to collaborate and communicate with other consultants in such a way that it makes it really easy to talk about issues. But in many ways, most importantly, it gives us the confidence to develop design proposals, knowing that you can make the changes to the model and the whole scheme works together as one. So I'm finding BIM very exciting. Nathan, if you just pass the next slide, if I just go next, then we can have the next slide because I'm not in control of the slides here. So I try and talk about BIM in a simple way as possible because I think it really should be something that's accessible to every company, whatever size you are and whatever kind of projects you're working on. But there are certain standards in a way that we should be aiming to meet. And we talk about BIM level 2 principles, which I think we're all aiming or striving towards. And they ask for particular processes to be in place. EIRs, which are Employer Information Requirements. And this document is actually quite a difficult one because it actually requires your client to come forward with specific or specification of their requirements in order for you to build your BIM model around. The evaluation of suppliers, I think that's fairly natural process that you need to go through. And then information modeled by the team so that everybody is working around the same principles on a model or multiple models that you can collaborate over. All built into a single share environment, and Nathan's already talked about the CDE, which is what Asite's so good at, is bringing the models together in one place. Common protocols so that we're all using the same language, and again, Nathan's talked about language, and I think this is where it becomes really important. Agreed tools, and the UK we use, I think we probably use it around the world now as well, which is the IFC, and it's worth saying that the IFC is a way that we can exchange models from different software platforms, IFC being Industry Foundation class. And you can imagine it like a very data-rich PDF, and that you can bring the models together all using the same language. And the BIM Execution Plan is a BIM Execution Plan that I think has helped us hugely. And if you don't do anything else, just think about planning your project around a BIM model and it'll help. Next. So Nathan can have the next slide. And so I haven't got long. I think I'm sort of trying to squeeze this into 10 minutes. So I thought I'd just focus on the BIM Execution Plan, which enables you to talk to the project team about what you want to get out of turning your model into a BIM project. I'm a huge fan of not trying to do everything perfectly the first time you do it, and be prepared partly to make mistakes, but also be prepared to kind of exclude things that you don't feel you're ready to tackle just yet. So you can do things in small steps rather than assuming right from the very start everything's going to be BIM level 2, otherwise it's not worth it. And by that I mean you can talk to your team and set your BIM goals and say, well, actually our goal is to be able to put the structural model and the architect's model together, and let's just leave it at that. Let's not make our goal for the first BIM project that we've ever done that we need to be able to do takeoffs and do cost measurements and plan programs and do 4D. Just put that sort of stuff to one side if it's the first time you're going to try it. And just keep the goals to manageable portions and think about the people that you're working with. Because you need to assess, as I said earlier, assess your supply chain. Well, actually, if you've assessed it and decided that the landscape architect isn't ready to take part in the BIM model, well, just exclude the landscape element from the BIM plan and focus on the big things that you can do. Can I have the next slide, Nathan? This always surprises me because we're not a huge company, and I never thought that we'd be using file names as long as this. But if there's one thing that you could take away from today, for me that would be to understand what the PAS 1192 asks you to do in terms of naming the information that you're sharing with other people. Because in many ways, to me, the file name is the language of BIM. If we're all using the same file naming convention, and you send a file to a structural engineer from an architect's office, and you become familiar with this kind of a file name, then the structural engineer will very quickly recognize what's in that particular file. And when I say file, we're now talking about bundles of data. And it kind of resolves that question that if you revise a part of your design, and you want to then understand which drawings are affected by that revision because your BIM model affects everything, then these file naming structures will enable you to issue revised data packages of different parts. Now, next slide, please, Nathan. I would love to have time to go through each of the items, each of the fields on that file name. I'll just touch on one or two because they're very powerful. And if we're all talking and using the same codes within the fields, then it becomes a natural conversation between two different consultants. Some of them are actually surprisingly hard, and the first one is the hardest, which is an agreed abbreviation for the project name. And that should really come from your client, but if the client isn't ready to sort of provide that information, you might have to just make it up to start with. Next one's fairly obvious, that's your organization abbreviated. But the next one, if I have any time at all, it'd be to concentrate on zones. By breaking your model down into different parts, you not only allocate responsibility for the design of different parts of the building and the design process, so you say, okay, here's a structural zone, and you define which bits of the data the structural engineer is responsible for. But you can also subdivide the building into zones for the future management of the building. We tend to subdivide our building into external envelope, cores, and fit out, knowing that you might have a tenant who wants to take on board the responsibility for the fit out areas and remodel the interior partitions and such like sometime in the future. And they can have that data package. You might have a core which requires a monthly routine of maintenance and payment of, I don't know, telephone serving lifts. And then you have the external envelope, which might need a much longer term maintenance schedule and plan and has a different regime in terms of the caretaking functions over the future. And so when you start a project and you subdivide it in the zones, it's worth thinking all the way through to how the building is going to be used and managed in the future too. Next slide, please, Nathan. I'll probably skip over a few of these because that's quite intricate as to how you manage the suitability of the information and how you then manage the revisions, and I don't think we've got enough time at the moment to do that, but that's the next chance you have in terms of managing how we share that data through the CDE. Next slide, Nathan. And the next slide, is there one more? So, oh yes, I was rather hoping this would kind of come up the stage. So this is looking at the file naming string for a project that we did for Middlesex University, and the first one tells you that that's Z2, floor 00, it's a 3D model, and it's a structural engineer's model. And I can, sorry, it's the architect's model, suitability level 1. The next one, next slide, Nathan, I think it comes up as just the code, yeah, shows you the 4th floor, zone 3 being the interior fit out, and it's the architect's M3, so a 3D model. And the next slide, please, Nathan, shows you the structural model for all floors. And the next slide, Nathan, so I am kind of flying through this, but the idea was to show you how these different parts of the model can all then be put into a single collaborative environment. In this instance, we brought all the IFC files into Tekla BIM site, which is another way of viewing IFC and examining a BIM model floor for conflicts and clashes. This sort of technology is very accessible and available to anybody to use. Next slide, Nathan. So just at the end, the why BIM is a really important question to ask yourself, because actually the answers are very different for different people. End users, to me, come top of the list, and that's really where the British government's ambition to reduce carbon costs and reduce overall construction costs is through the period of time when a building is in use, which I think is 70 to 80% of the overall cost of the building. Whereas often BIM is now seen as a way of making things build quicker and easier for the contractors. That's important, but there's also benefits for the design team. I see we moved on to the next slide, so I think I'm being asked to roll on, and I'm going to hand back to Nathan. Thank you very much. Are you still there, Nathan?
Hi, Paul. Yes, I'm here. You're fine to keep going. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I wasn't sure. I thought I only had 10 minutes. So I was kind of charging through. If we've ended up, but oh yeah, the last slide. So don't worry about the theory. So my message would be, don't be intimidated by BIM language and BIM speak. It's actually relatively straightforward. Once you've got to grips with using your software, you know, I was talking as if I'd assumed everybody understood that we're drawing in 3D now, and we're applying information to different parts of the model in order to kind of enrich the data that's carried by all those parts. Once you're drawing in 3D, you can do some terrific things just with the presentations and pulling off two-dimensional drawings at the same time as being able to collaborate and do the complicated stuff. So it's a good, fun approach. It's what all of us architects have always wanted to do ever since we left college. So that's a good thing. But just to repeat that message, if you find it intimidating and you feel that in order to achieve BIM level 2 there's just too much to handle, take a step back and just do it in small parts and exclude those things that you or your team don't feel you're ready for. And if you make that clear in your BIM execution plan and you state, we have excluded the landscape design from the BIM model, then you're still complying. You're just explaining that to the wider user group. Using it for good communication, absolutely. To me, BIM is really less about 3D modeling and information, and it's much more about communication. It is about language. It's a way of people who speak different languages, which architects speak different languages to engineers who speak different languages to cost consultants, etc. We all speak different languages, but the BIM is the tool that enables us all to communicate in a common environment. We don't have to change our language. We still speak the same old gobbledygook we ever did. We're just able to communicate it so that other people now have a sort of automatic translation tool at their fingertips. But it's very important that you have these kind of agreed principles across the team, that you sit down, you work with your team, and you're open and clear about what you're trying to achieve by introducing BIM into your projects. Ultimately reducing risk, and I think that's the really big win, reducing risk at every stage. I was going to talk about the design stage and the construction stage and then the user stage, and I think there's some really great successes out there. Thank you very much, Nathan.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. Very, very interesting. I've made some notes for us to talk about when we get to the roundtable phase. But first, first we have up next Dareen Salama from STV, who's going to speak about her experiences here in the U.S. market. Dareen?
Yes. Hi, Nathan. Hi, everyone. So my name is Dareen Salama, and I work at STV in the Project Controls Group. And the reason why I really have this slide usually is to highlight a couple of things. So first is that within the STV environment, we've got all disciplines and all functions almost under one roof. So we've got these three different divisions that are buildings and facilities, transportation infrastructure, and energy services that are all focused on design. And we've got construction management that's obviously focused on the construction phase. And we do have projects where we're working on them together. So that kind of helps us get over the hurdle of any challenges with contract delivery methods and model sharing and setting standards up front and thinking ahead, like Paul mentioned several times in his presentation. Really thinking, having the end in mind and thinking about the end deliverable. The other thing is that a lot of organizations today, I think in the U.S. at least, I'm not sure how it is in the U.K. right now, but in the U.S. I'm currently working in New York and other regions in the Northeast. The challenge is where does that BIM professional sit within the organization? And for us, it's that project controls group that really services all these divisions, but has a very strong focus on construction management. And that allows us to be involved in all stages. And it's not really become just a BIM professional, but it's emerged into other technologies as well. So if we move on to the next slide, you'll see that there's, it started with BIM, but then it really expanded to much more. And I'm sure anyone on the line who's working in that BIM role right now has that same experience, where you start off as a BIM specialist or BIM engineer or BIM professional, and then it quickly starts trickling down to and expanding that role to other functions. And what happened with our group is that it was really traditional project controls focusing on cost management, time management, project management systems, and then quickly expanded into BIM about 6 or 7 years ago. And then that today has become really emerging technology. So because we have to integrate with other applications, we have to start involving ourselves with other parts of the business, again, being that collaborative aspect of it, we have to be involved with other technologies, other functions, new technologies that weren't there before, with all the talk about, machine learning, virtual reality, photogrammetry, other types of interoperability. So our group has expanded really to cover that as well, and I think anyone who's working in the BIM world really finds themselves in that role automatically. So I'll talk to you a little bit about what we do. So next slide. Next, yes. So the first challenge I think that everyone faces is, I'd like to get started with BIM, or I'd like to start implementing BIM on this project or program, and really people think that, okay, I'm going to buy a couple of software. And not realizing the size of the investment that the company has to make in order to really be on board in that BIM world. It's not really, the investment is not only for one project, but the investment has to be from a company perspective as well. So with all these platforms that are on the screen, these are just examples. And you'll see that they touch upon every stage. It's more focused on construction, but they touch upon every stage and every function that we perform on a project, whether it's estimating, it's scheduling, it's org charts, it's designs, it's and any type of scanning or surveying, it's any type of data analysis. All that you have to touch upon in order to really develop a functional, collaborative, integrated environment. Otherwise, everyone just focuses on their own functionality. And the other notable thing here is that the technology, and I saw the poll pop up for the webinar here. The challenges really span not only technology and not only people and not only culture, but it spans all of them. So one of these challenges is the technology, and again, companies today, we find ourselves having to develop our own custom applications to support us in that integration effort. There are standards out there that are not widely implemented in the US, I would say. Everyone is really following a modified version of a standard that they developed that works for their own program. And everyone's still in the effort of developing a standard that could be adopted by everyone. File formats is a challenge. Hardware capability is a challenge. Even cloud-based systems, we get to a point where either we slow the system down, or we have challenges there, challenges accessing the data, challenges with API integration. So we find ourselves having to develop custom applications for ourselves, and I think that's a role that has to kind of evolve in our industry. Our industry is not used to having such a position, a programmer on your team to develop apps specifically for your project. So next slide. So another challenge I see is that, and we face all the time, and that's kind of one of the biggest reasons I think why we got involved in other functions, and not just, it's not strictly BIM, but it's really started getting involved in scheduling and estimating and document control and design and all this data that we're receiving. How do we make sure that the quality of this data is good and is accurate? It's good for us to use. It's in the correct format. It's actually accurate. It's validated. So a lot of people on the construction stage, I see, they would receive models either from the design team or from their subs, and you would immediately put them to work. You would immediately use them. But the truth is that even if we put standards in place, not everyone follows them. And I'm sure that people have been on projects where you have specifications and you spent a lot of time really putting together standards, but they're not exactly followed. And that's kind of a human element and the technology element in some cases as well, where the technology actually allows you to make such errors. And the prime example of that is scheduling. I mean, until today, schedules are not entirely accurate. and schedules still have mistakes even though there are standards in place, and it's something that's been done for a pretty long time. So it's the same with models, and it's even a larger problem because the time it takes for us to do model checking is significant. And I think that's a kind of a research opportunity, or an opportunity for the market and technology world to improve right now, is to allow us to do that automated model checking. We certainly have developed custom applications to help us do that, but it's really focusing on checking the model for the standards, class section, and coordination, but also making sure that the data is correct, the data fields are filled correctly. I mean, Paul also mentioned in his presentation how the standards and following the code structure really helps everyone work efficiently, and someone has to be checking that. If there's no quality audit or automated way of figuring out if a code is not in the right place, that has a huge impact, not just on people finding information, but also if I'm using that model for quantity takeoff or for scheduling, things start to not make much sense. The other thing is we're looking at advanced rule-based checking, code compliance checking that can be automated, and other analytics. I'll show an example of schedule analytics in the end, but other analytics based on the models. Right now we have different models for multiple projects, and how can we really use that data, that large amount of data that's in the model for our own benefit to help us with forecasting and with estimating future projects. Next slide, please. So another function that we use the model for is cost management. So again, I'm focused on kind of receiving the models. I'm not on the design end developing them or authoring them. So one aspect is the ability to compare one model to the next. One aspect is not having to repeat the work that we've done, and for example, checking one model that we received and making sure that the quality is accurate, making sure everything is correct. Then I receive a different iteration or a second iteration. I should be able to compare that and only check the objects or the elements that I did not focus on before, or they're new in the model, or they've changed, so I need to just recheck them and make sure they match my standards. That's one benefit, and the other benefit is being able to compare quantities, and that's really from a cost management perspective, either during the design stage of doing continuous estimating and making sure that I'm not exceeding my budget, or if I am exceeding my budget, why is it, and is that happening? A lot of times you have an estimate that suddenly increased the budget by 10%, and the design team and the client and everyone starts wondering what happened on the project, and we have workshops to try to figure out what really is driving that cost that high. So that's a beneficial aspect there. And then the third benefit here is from a change order management perspective, being able to better negotiate change orders, because then if we're all working collaboratively off of one model to evaluate that change order, to evaluate that quantity change, then the discussion all shifts from how did you do your quantity takeoff to the price negotiation, which is really what we should be focusing on, and that quantity takeoff process becomes much more efficient. So next slide. The next benefit for really utilizing BIM during the construction stage, and also I think it's a very good example of how systems can work together and multiple people can work together to develop one product, is really tracking the work in place. So if I look at this slide here, there's multiple elements. There's an element of inputting data in iPads by field inspectors. There's an element of pushing that data back to the model where a BIM specialist is sitting there making sure that the data gets updated correctly, the visualization is updated correctly. So green is for work in place, red is for work that's not installed yet. A BIM specialist is working on that model, making sure that it's coded correctly, integrated with the schedule. So there's a scheduler element there as well. So making sure that the schedule is accurate and integrating the schedule data with the BIM data. And then a cost manager aspect as well, where they're making sure that the cost loading of the schedule is correct to be able to produce the curve that you see on the top left that says conduit work in place status. So you see two curves, the red and the blue. Those are the early and the late dates derived from the cost loaded schedule of that particular area of work. So that's only for conduits. And that coding is what allows us to actually filter that information, right? So if it's coded correctly, then I can extract it. And if it's coded correctly from the field inspector's daily report, I can extract manpower that relates to that same type of work. And then we can cross-compare how are we doing. Where's the green curve is the work in place that's extracted from the model in terms of quantities. And then I see that the green curve is trending to be flat and intersecting with the blue curve. That means that, okay, I'm delayed here. So what do I need to do? You'll see that the chart below it shows that the manpower increased, and then the productivity of the work started increasing again, and then finally we would be able to meet our baseline schedule dates. So I think that's a prime example of having data from different sources, different people, different software, and making sure it works together to really benefit the project overall in the end. Next slide. Another example of that collaboration is really taking it to the closeout phase and the commissioning phase. So traditionally, we would have the commissioning agent filling out checklists in a PDF or a Word document or something like that. We converted that to a live data form where they could fill that on their iPads or mobile apps, and that could be done on any platform that allows them to fill out forms on a mobile app or a mobile device. And that just really, with a very simple, again, back to the coding, with a very simple code for the equipment tag, making sure that that equipment tag is both in the model and in that form. So that way I'm not really introducing a huge cultural change. I'm only asking them to fill it out on an iPad instead of paper or instead of a Word document. And that makes sure that I have the data, and therefore I can then connect it in an asset management system once I'm done with all these checklists, convert it into, get that geometry from the model and get that data from my project management information system and push it into an asset management database. Next. So that's the example of the checklists, having them on the tablet. That's the screenshot from the tablet view. And it's not only that, but also linking them to the O&M manuals, where you see screenshots of the PDFs there, linking them to the O&M manuals from that same PMIS system, from that submittal record, to make sure that, okay, I have integration between the model, the commissioning checklist, and the O&M manual. Finally, so next slide. Finally, you can have that integration handed over to the asset management system. Now, that's, I think, a widely researched topic today. I know that multiple airports are working on figuring out the best workflow to do that. A lot of people are there with transferring just the information, but the challenge still remains of how do you integrate that with the model from a visual perspective, and what happens when you have changes and who maintains that. So that's still a question, but the general idea is that you have data that's coming from the project management information system, data that's coming in from the BIM model, regardless of what format it's in. Then that gets transferred into the asset management system, and that asset management system may have integrations with other systems like financials or accounting systems that you have in your organization. So that kind of covers everything that I've been working on so far. If we look at a futuristic view, we're currently doing some research on how can we really analyze the model data, right? So we've gotten that far with scheduling and estimating. So this is a sample from our scheduling data analytics, where we can produce these curves or forecasts or trends in real time. You can have it as a dashboard on your phone. So I think we have to get there with the model data as well. We've achieved certain milestones there, and I know a lot of people are working on it now, but really how to expose that data that's within the model to others in a form that they can digest on their mobile phone, quickly get information out of the model rather than having to go to a BIM specialist to be able to open and navigate their model, or to have a very powerful computer to be able to access the model. But really getting such statistics and analytics out of the model and metrics to be able to benefit the project as a whole.
Great. Thank you, Dareen.
Thank you.
That's well, we'll get to it in the questions, but lots of interesting stuff about the technologization, if that's a word, of the construction industry. Thanks very much. Up next is George Mokhtar from Turner and Townsend. George.
Hi, Nathan. Hi, guys. So I've got a very different presentation to the one that the two guys have given, but it's really good to see some of the insight from other people and where they are on their journey. If you could just flick into the slides, Nathan. Yeah. So what I'm really going to talk about, I'm going to introduce myself first, but what I really wanted to talk about is actually just this whole process of Build Earth Live and what I see that it does for not just people who take part in the organisation, but people in the wider industry, what lessons can be learned from it, and how we can actually use it as a platform to start really testing how things work in an environment which allows us to be agile. A lot of the time, people, trial and test things on projects, and you get some feedback, and trying to understand and calculate where the actual cost benefit is can be quite difficult. But if you take all of those processes and take all of this sort of multidisciplinary collaboration which goes on during the design phase and really squeeze it down into an extremely high pressure, tight program, you can actually bring all of the inefficiencies of the process to the top and really start understanding where you can and can't get more out of a project with the same people that you already have working on it. So just quickly about us. I sit within an organisation called Turner and Townsend. There's 3 business units of that, and we sit in a part called advisory. So I'm up in charge of the BIM team, and essentially what we do is we kind of do 5 things. We work to understand what the existing situation is, either on a project, program, portfolio, or how an organisation's working. So we do sort of gap reports to understand where a client wants to be, where they are now, and kind of what the difference is, what the roadmap is to get them there, to understand the strategy. The next thing that we do is the strategic setup. So some of the things Paul mentioned earlier, like employees information requirements, asset information requirements. Basically, the guys that you can see on the picture there are mostly the BIM team, which are a set of multidisciplinary people who have previous... one second. So you've got a set of multidisciplinary people who have previous experience actually delivering projects. So what we've done is we've taken that talent and that knowledge and we've pulled them into an environment where we're actually asking the right questions on the client's behalf and making sure that the right questions are asked to the design team, the contractors, so that the entire process is mapped out from start to finish. And that includes everything from multidisciplinary design through to cost management, project management, the asset information handover, and things that are possible during the construction phase. So if you can switch to the next slide, Nathan. So this is the only sort of consultant diagram which I'm going to show you. From our perspective, I see there's different stakeholders involved in BIM. Yes, you've got your end user, but you've got data producers and data consumers. You've got the likes of the architects and other designers, subcontractors who have to produce a lot of information. Then you have other people on the other side who have to consume a lot of information. And I see those end users and consumers as, the easiest way I can put it is they just want to buy something. And they want to buy something that's got the right instructions, and they want to know that it's been built in line with a standard, and they want to make sure that they're able to understand how it works. And it's as simple as that. And BIM is essentially the development of that digital version of the asset. It's the instructions for how they're actually going to use that asset. And not only do they want that when it's delivered, but they actually want early sight of that so they can understand what they're going to get and what they're actually buying. So it's all about this program level or portfolio level understanding of what a client really wants in terms of data, how that can be asked for in the right way, and having the foresight to think about this long term. This basically fits into our sort of, we have our sort of motto when it comes to working up a good BIM project. And basically the key to success on a good BIM project is really simple. It's basically forward thinking, really detailed planning and understanding, shared understanding across the table, so you've got a lot of emerging tools and technologies and everyone needs to be on the same page with that, and transparency and openness, and all these things are kind of enabled by technology and underpinned by collaboration, and I think it's really as simple as that. If you just click to the next slide. So this is what we're going to talk about. I really just wanted to talk a little bit about, you know, Build Earth Live and what that's done for us and what that's done for the industry as far as I'm aware. I used to work at a consultancy as part of a university in the north of England, and we had BIM Academy had some early success with Build Earth Live, and I was part of the team that led some of those winning bids. And what was very clear at the time for us was that it was a great opportunity to start getting people talking within an industry and actually understanding how people work in a sort of risk-free environment where everyone's working as one holistic project team rather than a group of individual stakeholders which are all working contracted on a project. So it really sort of broke down some of the barriers you get, like the three key things which always are barriers to a good BIM project, which is usually sort of willingness, scopes and contract, and communication. And I think this is a really good test bed to try and break down some of those barriers. Hyperloop Dubai is just one of the many Build Earth Live competitions, and you can see that how the industry is actually developing globally, not just in the UK, but as and when these competitions happen, you can see the level of understanding, not just in terms of how the technology is used, but how people communicate is getting better and better. And it's almost like you can see a disruptive process emerging as a sort of global industry. If you just click to the next slide. And this is kind of what my slant is on it. This is an extract from a paper which we wrote a few years ago, which was rather catchily named A Theoretical Comparison of Traditional and Integrated Project Delivery Design Processes on International BIM Competitions, which is quite specific if you're into weekend reading. But essentially, what this is actually demonstrating on the left-hand side is how you can measure effort. So the amount that you can see in that band, that yellow band, is the amount of effort and resource which is poured into a project, and the amount of time which is taken up by the people working on it, and how that's expanded because there's more iterations of the design process. Now, the whole ideology around BIM and early collaboration is getting all of the designs at concept stage really well coordinated and understood and signed off by the client, and having better earlier engagement from these end users to ultimately focus in on exactly what this design is going to be as early as possible. So you can start really getting the right decisions made early in the process when there's less resource and cost associated with change, and there's actually more opportunity to change. You know, moving a door in concept stage takes 2 seconds. Moving one once you've built, it's quite a different story altogether. And I think for every element in the whole building, you know, it's just exponentially multiplied. So what we actually did in this paper is we actually looked at the difference between how a team can work when they're separately producing information and have, I think there was 1 or 2 iterations of sharing over the course of a 2-day period. And the second one is where we had more fluid sharing, as well as actual co-location. We said that we'd increase the increments of sharing information so that we had more digital co-location. And this took us from a culture of communicating things backwards and forwards and working through problems to passive communication and actually resolving problems before they became problems. So we kind of measured this over the course of 2 48-hour projects. If you just click to the next slide. Just next slide, Nathan.
Yep, there you go.
Yeah. So what we did was we looked at that over the 2 separate projects, and what you can actually see is with more use of the collaborative BIM suite, CBIM, and with more increments of shared communication, everyone knew what each other were doing. There was much more flexibility and efficiency, and the bandwidth of the actual resource that was being expended minimised quite significantly. Now, this is just over a 2-day period, and actually these inefficiencies usually go by unnoticed. So what we do as an organisation, as well as actually manage the technical side of this, is manage the stakeholder engagement, end user engagement, and how people work together collaboratively, enabled by tools like Asite and CBIM, to just try and pull these inefficiencies down, because it's something which goes unnoticed across a project, which happens across many years. But once you put this pressure in this compacted program into play, you can actually really start to see the inefficiencies in the process. That's why I'm supportive of this as an initiative. So I'm gonna hand it back to you, Nathan. I hope I only took me 5 minutes there. We've got a little bit of time for a roundtable discussion, and I hope that was useful. Cheers.
George, thanks very much, and thanks Paul and Dareen for that. So yeah, we've got just under 15 minutes left in the webinar. We've had a few questions coming in, and we've got a number of questions to discuss. One thing that I'm going to pick up on, which is kind of was a theme of all of your presentations. And Paul, I'm going to ask you first to speak. One of the things that's been thrown around here is construction companies or AEC companies basically becoming software companies. So what do you think about that, Paul? To what degree do you think AEC companies, regardless of your discipline, now really need to be software experts?
Yeah, I think that may be a really interesting debate, not just for the construction industry, but for every industry. We're all moving into data. But I'm not sure that BIM necessarily is the reason why that might happen. I think there's many other wider advantages of BIM. The primary one being the one that you suggest, which is we're all talking the same language. And another huge bonus is the one that George was saying in terms of your vision and leading to transparency and openness. So there's a demand. BIM really demands the sharing of information, and we just have to be much less reticent about lending files to other people who are then going to make use of the raw data that is contained within our files. So yeah, I get a kind of fear of software, but that's just modern life. I think BIM, moving away from the software side of it, is actually about people sitting on two sides of a table in a design team meeting and being much more open and transparent about the quality of the information they've got that they're going to share with the other team, and I think that's a real bonus.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think one of your points at the beginning there is very pertinent. It's not just construction and the AEC; it's every industry that's being changed by software and technology, and change means of communication. Dareen, question for you. Picking up on what Paul's just said, and has been a theme. So software, technology. But what are your experiences of sitting down at the beginning of that project, of any project, with the various trades around the table and agreeing principles, agreeing how you're going to communicate? Is that something that you see is accepted, or are there still barriers?
I think that it highly depends on the team that's involved on the project. I mean, I've been involved on both ends. If you find someone who has, if you're in the general culture of the whole project, not specifically the people that are sitting around the table from a BIM perspective and trying to agree on the technology, I think that we all, in this world of technology and collaboration and BIM, I mean, we're promoting that within our companies and within our projects. So when we sit around the table and talk, it's definitely extremely collaborative, more than any other discussion I'm in within the industry. But if the team has not done this before, know nothing about what BIM is other than that it's a requirement. And the culture of either the organization or the area that they're working in or the previous projects that they work in is adversarial, and they've not implemented BIM before, and that BIM is something that, you know, can be sub-consultant to a company, or that it's not really needed, we're just doing it for sake of visualization or because the client said they want it or something like that, then you find challenges. But when really BIM people sit around the table, I think it's a very highly collaborative discussion, because we've all done this before and we really want the best result for the project. So it's really a successful attitude to have on a project.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, I've spent the last 20-odd years sitting with project teams of different stripes, talking about standards and collaboration. You know, not necessarily BIM, but how do we work together? And I totally agree with you. Sometimes it's an easy conversation, and other times it isn't. It all depends on the perspectives of the people around the table, right? So, question for you, George, which I'm going to throw this. This is, you probably had this question before, but so you've worked across. I know you've worked across lots of different projects and different types of projects. So across those projects, generally, what do you think? Is there usually one single BIM, or are there usually lots of BIMs?
That's a good point, and it depends what you mean by BIM.
Yeah.
So, I mean, depends on the size of the project, depends on the stage of the project. What you generally get is, if it's a small project, you'll have multidisciplinary team working together, and you'll likely have 3 sort of core models and then many specialists which can come in later on. So what you actually have is you actually have one project information model. And the project information model is a federated data set with 3D information and metadata which all can come together and speak the same language. And what you're likely going to have is 1 or more models from each discipline, and then you're going to have a federated model, which is your project information model. That usually starts out as one version of the truth, or one version of the source of information. As and when you move into construction phase, you quite often get an overlay of subcontractor information, which can be in different types of software for fabrication and other things. So what you end up there with is still one project information model, which is this whole combined data set which can all sit in one place on a common data environment. But what you'll tend to find is that you'll then have almost, in some cases, a mirror image of the original design proposal, and then the sort of fabrication information which sits on top of that, some of which needs to be migrated across back into the base model for handover. And then they get handover to the asset information model, which essentially is, there's all of your information, Mr. or Mrs. Client. You can pull that data across into your system and keep these models where you need to access them. So in truth, I'd say there's many different models. I quite often explain it as a light box. In old terms, of just one big light box, and everybody's design information is printed onto a bit of acetate, and they're all just sitting on top. Everyone's still responsible for their own information. Usually you've got one person responsible for overseeing the coordination of that information on the entire project, and the way that we do it then is you've usually got one independent party reviewing and checking, again, as Dareen mentioned, using automated rule sets and other things, the quality of the information against the actual standards set out in the EIR. So that might be things which are going to have an impact on quantification, things which are going to have an impact on analysis from other consultants, and things which are going to cause an impact or delay on the project itself, like the actual completeness of the model. So lots, basically, in short.
Yeah, fair enough. I know that's an open-ended question, and your immediate response is, depends on what you mean by BIM. I think is probably probably the key answer, right? So.
If you look at it another way, okay, everything that's going to be built needs to be modeled, okay, to a certain extent, and that might exist as an actual 3D representation or a detail associated with that model. everything's going to have that. It's going to have to come together in one combined place so that we've got a full picture of what's actually going to be built. And you need that to analyze it and to make sure that what's going to be built is going to be risk-free and it's going to be actually what the client's paid for. So ultimately, the critical thing for this, whether it's one model or, I've seen thousands of models on projects before, is it's imperative that there's one common understood way of naming things, modeling things, sharing things.
Agreed. Standard.
Might just can I chip in there as well, George? Because for those that are only just starting out in BIM, the notion that everything is going to be built needs to be modeled can be quite a challenging concept. And just to be clear, that doesn't necessarily, and I think you did say this, it doesn't necessarily mean that everything has to be modeled in a 3D software CAD type environment. It could easily be entered into a spreadsheet, or it could be included in the specification, and it still comes as data from those elements.
I've never asked an architect to model all the wall ties.
Exactly.
I think that's a great point.
And we in the office, we in the office have a very, very simple rule that we only ever model things that would normally be seen at 1:50 in 3D, and everything else then is captured through other schedules and specifications.
Can I throw a question to Dareen here? Dareen, we've heard from Paul and George a lot about the UK standards that have been developed over the recent years, and you touched in your presentation on standards adoption here in the US market. My question for you is, what standards, if any, are there any that you see being used here here in the US? Is it are things coming from the UK, or are there standards in the US that are starting to be adopted, or is there still nothing?
I think that's still in progress. I mean, there are standards that are developed. The question is whether they're adopted or not. And what I really see happening, and at least the projects I'm involved in, or the circles that I'm involved in, we all ask each other, what have you done before, so that we can learn from each other. We kind of have these, groups that help each other. Like there's an airport group that started with Denver Airport about, I would say 2 years ago, that started developing standards for airports, BIM standards for airport. There's the national BIM standards, of course, and we refer to COBE and we refer to IFC and things like that, but it's not like it's widely adopted like the UK. And I think we need that in the US, something to be driven down from the top as a mandate, and something to be common ground for the whole country, but I don't think we're there yet.
Yeah, as you mentioned the national BIM standards. Go on, Paul.
I was going to say, from my experience with US projects, which is probably more limited than yours, I agree. There is a national way of doing things, and as a region globally, you're quite mature in using the software and things like that. But I think one of the things which has been quite successful over here is the push-pull, and the UK government basically, as a client, stamping the feet and saying, we want this. This is no longer up for negotiation, and it kind of drives a culture of change, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. As with anything in our industry, AEC or EPC industry, ultimately what gets implemented is what gets driven down from the client, right? In that case, the UK government has made a clear step, and I agree, Dareen. We need something similar in the US. National BIM standard is a great start, but we need some impetus to get it more widely adopted, right? So it's unfortunately, I think we could carry on for
the only thing you should be mindful of there is the cat. Yeah.
Go on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, sorry,
unfortunately,
just me closing comment on that one is he. Yeah, go on, Nathan, finish off.
I was just going to cut you off, but go ahead. Finish your thought.
I was only going to say the only thing you've got to worry about there is the catalyst for a mandate like that is usually a big financial crisis. So just be mindful of that one. Careful with it.
Fair enough. Well, we'll leave you hanging on that, audience. We've hit 12 o'clock Eastern, 5 o'clock GMT, which is the end of the hour webinar. But I think we could carry on a lot longer. But and I hope we all do outside of the bounds of the webinar. I'd like to extend my my great thanks to all three of you, Paul, Dareen, and George, for your time and your efforts in presenting and discussing with us. It's greatly appreciated, and I hope we've had a good turnout in the audience, and everybody out there on the audience listening will be circulating a recording of today's if you want to refer back to today's webinar, and for those who weren't able to make it, you'll be able to watch it online. So again, thanks all, and we'll carry on the conversation in the wider industry.
Cheers, Nathan. Thanks.